Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much to the organisers for the opportunity to present. I'll just try and share my screen now. Okay. Okay. To attempt to identify the source of the blood on the rider's garment in Revelation 19:13 is to address one small exegetical component of a much larger scholarly discussion concerning the interpretation of violent themes in the book of Revelation. None of the violent images employed in the Apocalypse can be adequately appraised in isolation. They appear often as repeated elements throughout an intricately structured and stylized literary whole, and they are, to a large extent, products of an extensive web of intertextual relationships. Consideration of these formative intertextual relationships must include the multiplicity of themes, allusions, partial quotations, and images that are derived from the Hebrew Bible, as well as interaction with the traditions preserved in later Jewish apocalypses, such as 2 Baruch, 4 Ezra, and the parables of Enoch. The war scroll discovered at Qumran, 1 QM, dated just before the turn of the 1st century CE, also provides important material for comparison as an extended treatise on eschatological warfare, which combines earthly and heavenly dimensions. Even focusing on a single image, or rather combination of images, such as the rider on the white horse in Revelation 19, requires further delimitation of scope for a short paper such as this. For this reason, I have chosen only to deal with some of the more obvious features of intertextual and literary dependency that influence the interpretation of Revelation 19:13. In particular, I will consider the author's reuse of Isaiah 63, 1-6, and the relationship between Revelation 19, 11-16 and Revelation chapter 14. Scholarly debate around the interpretation of violent themes in the Apocalypse is far-reaching and wide-ranging, but the following observations are offered as a contribution to an ongoing conversation typified by the work of 2 scholars in particular, Paul Middleton and Richard Borkham. Middleton has published prolifically on the subject of martyrdom in early Christianity and the Book of Revelation, including the recent 2018 monograph, The Violence of the Lamb, Martyrs as Agents of Divine Judgment in the Book of Revelation, in which he argues that though Christian martyrs in John's constructed literary world follow the example of Christ, the proto-martyr, they are vindicated as a result and, quote, through their vindication, they share in the execution of divine judgment, and thus the martyr becomes, in the Apocalypse, an agent of violent divine judgment. Christian martyrs in this sense offer their lives in self-sacrifice, but in doing so earn the right to subsequently exercise bloodthirsty retribution against their enemies. In each of these aspects, they are following the example of Christ, the proto-martyr and executor of violent judgment. It is this reading, supported by detailed argument throughout, that frames Middleton's interpretation of the White Rider in Revelation 19 as another Christophanic vision describing a moment in the narrative sequence of Revelation at which sufferer becomes torturer and martyr becomes agent of vengeance. Middleton's work responds in part to a number of interpreters who look to Revelation in some way as a model of nonviolent resistance. Richard Borkham in particular has contributed a great deal of exegetical supporting argument to nonviolent readings of Revelation through his 2 books on the Apocalypse and a 1985 paper, The Book of Revelation as a Christian War Scroll. Middleton engages frequently with Borkham, and one of the clearest points of departure between their interpretative strategies is illustrated by their treatment of the lion and lamb imagery in Revelation chapter 5. For Borkham, the sequence of hearing, the traditionally militant description of verse 5, behold, the lion that is from the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has overcome, and then seeing a lamb standing as if slain, constitutes a deliberate reinterpretation of militaristic messianic images in terms of suffering self-sacrifice. Christ and his followers conquer and overcome, but they do so not by means of military might and force of arms, but through faithful witness unto death. 12:11. Middleton criticizes this interpretation as reading an unnecessary incongruity between the two images, and points to the apparently violent attributes and activities of the lamb. It has 7 horns, wages war, rules with an iron rod, and inflicts or oversees judgment, which includes, according to Middleton's reading, torture. He argues for an expressly sacrificial dimension to the lamb imagery, but reads martyrdom as a stage in a sequence which qualifies martyrs to subsequently operate as violent agents of divine judgment. The image in 19:11-16 of the White Rider wielding a sword and clothed in a robe dipped in blood, leading armies dressed in white, is therefore interpreted by Middleton as another presentation of Christ and his martyrs, but this time riding in to exercise violent retribution described in verses 17-21. This paper addresses the question as to whether further exegetical consideration of this verse supports either of the two readings proposed or suggests alternative conclusions. I'll just read this passage, 19:11-16, my own translation. And I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse, and the one seated on it who is called Faithful and True. And in righteousness he judges and wages war, and his eyes are like a flame of fire. And upon his head, which has a name written which no one knows except himself, are many crowns. And he is clothed with a robe dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. And the armies in heaven were following him upon white horses, wearing linen white and pure. And from his mouth a sharp sword goes out, that he might strike the nations with it. And he will shepherd them with a rod of iron. And he treads the winepress of the wine of the passion of the wrath of the all-powerful God. And on his robe and on his leg he has a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. This sequence is full of language and imagery that is explicitly militaristic, judging and waging war, armies of riders, and a sword. The armies dressed in white linen also echo the martial imagery of the 144,000 in chapter 14, who fulfill the requirements of purity for soldiers to be able to engage in active combat, 14:1 and 4-5, and also bear a divine name on their heads. Reiterating terms from the first 3 chapters of Revelation, the moniker Faithful and True, eyes like a flame of fire, and the sharp sword protruding from the mouth all confirm the identity of the principal rider as Christ. See 1:14-16, 2:12, 16:18, and 3:14. Christ is portrayed in this scene using multiple images drawn directly from Isaiah 63, 1-6, including the blood-stained garments mentioned 5 times in Isaiah 63, 1-3, the treading of the winepress referred to 6 times in verses 1-6, and the anger and wrath of God in verse 6. In the Isaiah sequence, the blood which stains the garments is explicitly identified as the blood of God's enemies. Verse 6, I trod down the peoples in my anger and made them drunk in my wrath, and I poured out their lifeblood on the earth. Several examples from the Targums show that this tradition continued to be drawn upon among various Jewish groups in subsequent centuries and long after John wrote his Apocalypse. 2 versions of fragmentary Targums on Genesis 49:11 speak of the King Messiah who goes out against those who hate him, kills kings and rulers, and reddens the mountains with the blood of their slain. Both versions refer to his garments either rolling in blood or being made clear, depending upon emendations to the Aramaic, and also refer to his cloak being whitened with the fat of their mighty ones. The Vatican manuscript version adds at the end of this sequence, and he is like one who presses grapes. These sources demonstrate that the images drawn upon in Revelation 19:11-16 of the blood-stained garment and the treading of the winepress were part of an attested tradition within wider Jewish circles that applied the language and concepts of Isaiah 63, 1-6 to the eschatological victory of the Messiah, and make it very clear that the blood staining the victor's garments and produced by the treading of the winepress was identified as the blood of his enemies, in continuity with the explicit sense of Isaiah 63. The question for our current purposes is, does the author of Revelation use these images in the same way? Or does he, as Borkham argues, deliberately reinterpret these traditionally militant themes, in effect repudiating apocalyptic militancy? To begin to answer this question, we must turn to the issue of literary context within Revelation itself, and in particular chapter 14, where the image of treading the winepress is first introduced. Middleton acknowledges that, quote, "It is not likely that the events of chapters 14 and 19 should be understood as separate events," end quote. At the beginning of chapter 14, we're introduced to the 144,000, who share certain characteristics with the rider and his armies in chapter 19. They bear divine names on their heads. They're described as chaste and ritually pure in verses 4 and 5, which parallel the garments of fine linen, white and pure in 19:14. And they follow the Lamb wherever he goes, 14:4. Both Borkham and Middleton identify the 144,000 in chapter 14 as an army of martyrs. It is notable that in the middle of the description of the ritual and moral purity of the martyrs in 14:4-5, we read that these have been purchased from among men as first fruits to God and to the Lamb. NASB, emphasis mine. This is the language of both sacrifice and harvest. In the Hebrew scriptures, first fruits are mentioned 5 times with explicit reference to grain, dough, wheat, or flour. I've given you the references on the slide. 9 times without specification, first fruits of the soil, ground, or harvest in general. 4 times with the triple designation grain, new wine, and oil. And on 2 further occasions, the first fruits of grapes are mentioned. References to grain, dough, wheat, or flour do not discount grapes or new wine as a typical feature of the offering of first fruits. They merely emphasize the grain offering according to the purposes of their immediate contexts. Ezekiel 44:30 refers to first fruit offerings of every kind. When applied to the army of martyrs in the context of Revelation 14, the designation first fruits strongly suggests a reference to grapes and new wine, as we are about to read of the wine of the passion of the immorality of Babylon in verse 8, the wine of the passion of God in verse 10, the reaping of the ripe harvest of the earth in verses 15 and 16, the gathering of the clusters of ripe grapes from the vine of the earth in verses 18 and 19, and the treading of the great winepress of the passion of God in verses 19 and 20, which produces blood that came out from the winepress up to the horses' bridles for a distance of 200 miles, verse 20. The most logical reading of the literary sequence in chapter 14 strongly suggests that the martyrs should be identified as the sacrificial first fruits of the grape harvest, which are reaped and then trodden in the winepress, producing a stream of blood which reached the height of the horses' bridles. The fate of God's enemies is described entirely differently. They are being tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb, perhaps corresponding to the activity of the third angel introduced in verse 18, who has power over fire, rather than the first two angels who carry sickles for reaping, verses 14 to 17. Though these scenes present an entirely different challenge to non-violent readings of Revelation, which must be dealt with on another occasion, what appears clear is that the blood produced by the treading of the winepress is the blood of the martyrs, just as G.B. Caird had in fact suggested in his commentary back in 1966. And I'm skipping over now a section where I summarize some 11 or so additional supporting arguments that Caird gives for this reading. But all of them, he draws on shared early Christian traditions, use of the Hebrew Bible, and more literary analysis of chapter 14. But all of his arguments stem from that fundamental premise of the connection between the first fruits at the beginning of chapter 14 and the grape harvest and the treading of the winepress later in that same chapter. So I've summarized Caird's exegetical arguments. I'll read this part just to put in context their significance in terms of the conversation with Middleton. I've summarized Caird's exegetical arguments, none of which are explicitly addressed by Middleton when he dismisses Caird's reading of chapter 14, although it must be acknowledged that throughout his monograph, Middleton deals with some of the interpretative themes reflected in Caird's position at considerable length. Caird's arguments are based on interpretation of imagery drawn from the Hebrew Bible, analogous early Christian traditions, and the literary analysis of chapter 14. In weighing this particular exegetical issue, Caird has advanced numerous compelling arguments which remain without detailed response or grounds for dismissal. These arguments stem principally from the same logical literary connection that I've highlighted above, the description of martyrs as first fruits and the grape harvest and trodden winepress. Chapter 19 then displays numerous direct literary connections to chapter 14, finding agreement among our interlocutors that it likely refers to the same event. When we are introduced to Christ as a white rider whose robe is dipped in blood, whose blood should we logically assume, therefore, that the author is referring to? In light of the context of chapter 14, the blood on the rider's robe is the blood of the martyrs. For this reason, when considering the blood on the rider's robe as an example of the kind of martial imagery typically employed in the apocalypse, in this particular instance, we should conclude that Borkham's approach, which reads John as deliberately inverting or reinterpreting violent imagery from the Hebrew scriptures and contemporary messianic traditions, in this case Isaiah 63, 1-6, should be preferred to the interpretation of Middleton and others who identify the blood as that of Christ's conquered enemies. As I signaled at the beginning of my paper, this constitutes only a small piece of a very large exegetical puzzle concerning the interpretation of violent themes in Revelation. Nevertheless, in this specific instance, it is my conclusion that a fresh examination of the blood on the rider's robe in Revelation 19 contributes towards a reading of Revelation that understands it to be reinterpreting traditionally violent and militaristic themes in order to effectively invert them, resulting in a literary and theological repudiation of militaristic violence. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John.